Not too long ago, I saw that a fairly popular content creator by the name of Brooke Houts had uploaded a video onto her YouTube channel. It was the third video in her Bible study series discussing the Gospel of John. Seemed like a fairly innocuous video by a fairly respectable Christian, and yet the video was flooded with dislikes and hounded with nothing but vitriolic rage in the comments section. I also noticed that Brooke Houts had been hemorrhaging subscribers, losing thousands every single day. Why? Because in August of 2019, footage emerged of Brooke Houts violently beating her pet dog, and her reputation has simply never recovered. While trying to film a video, her dog kept getting into the shot and being disruptive, to which she felt an appropriate response was to punch, spit on, and drag that dog. And astonishingly, this is something that she forgot to edit out of the final footage and uploaded herself onto her own channel for everybody to see. And as you can imagine, her channel was immediately burned to the ground, and the embers are still being kept alight to this day, almost 3 years later, by the untiring efforts of self-described dog lovers who still regularly comment on her content, telling her that they will never forget or forgive the animal abuse that she was responsible for. And who can blame them? Abusing an animal is considered by many, especially on the internet, to be the cardinal sin. It's the crime that any person with even a modicum of common ethical sense is rightly disgusted by, and something we can't just expect people to forget about and move on. We are, after all, a nation of animal lovers, are we not? So how can we possibly stand for this kind of cruelty? And this kind of outrage was repeated in this country just last week. As I'm sure you will have seen all over social media, the West Ham footballer Kurt Zouma recently decided, perhaps against better judgment, to drop-kick his pet cat across his kitchen floor. And when footage of this became public, he was immediately condemned by everyone from fellow footballers to mainstream news to even the mayor of London, calling him a disgrace and calling for him to face criminal prosecution for his actions. For kicking his pet cat, Kurt Zouma was fined £250,000 by his football club and had his cat confiscated by the RSPCA. This again makes sense, since we are a nation of animal lovers. That's why when, astonishingly, Kurt Zouma was chosen to play in his next match, even after this footage had come out, he was subject to constant booing and chants, and when he was knocked down with an injury, fans shouted from the stadium, "That's how your cat feels." Animal abuse is, it seems, the truly unforgivable crime. But if, ladies and gentlemen, you feel yourself feeling a sense of sympathy with the condemnation of Brooke Houts or of Kurt Zouma, I ask you to reserve your judgment for just a moment as I present to you what I consider to be the greatest moral paradox of our age. As sad as it is, I simply can't agree that we are, in fact, a nation of animal lovers. And I think that if we examine our practices as a society more closely, we'll find that to say we're one that cares for the well-being of its animals is not just wrong, but laughably wrong, exactly wrong. Why? Well, because painful as the experience of Houts' dog or Kurt Zouma's cat was, an incalculably higher number of equally innocent, equally intelligent creatures are regularly subjected to unimaginably worse tortures, most of which are too grotesque to specify without a content warning, in the production of the food that we eat. My thesis for you today is really quite simple. If a dog being punched or a cat being kicked fills you with rage, then good, it should. That makes sense. But if we're going to condemn the unnecessary infliction of harm upon animals, we simply must do so consistently. An effort to condemn it, whether it occurs in Kurt Zouma's kitchen or on the farm that produces the contents of his fridge. You may think that I'm sensationalizing or exaggerating. Farm animals are nothing like pets, and they're specifically bred in order to be eaten. And besides, eating meat is perfectly natural. Kurt Zouma kicking his cat is nothing like any of this. Well, I just want to tell you about the life of the average pig on a UK factory farm, and you can decide for yourself whether you think it even comes close to being worthy of the label of natural. On UK farms, pigs are forcibly impregnated to give birth to piglets stuck in a farrowing crate, not too different from the size of the circle that I'm currently stood on. Those piglets, to prevent themselves from attacking each other later in life, will often have their tails cut off and their teeth yanked out without anesthetic. Those piglets who are too sick to be profitable will be killed, and one of the most common ways of doing this is known as blunt force trauma, or more colloquially, thumping, whereby a pig is taken by its hind legs and has its skull literally smashed into the floor repeatedly until it dies. Now, caving in a piglet's skull against the pavement may seem like a fairly eccentric and cruel way to dispose of its life, but rest assured, because the National Pig Association in this country has referred to thumping as, quote, an effective and appropriate way of humanely killing a piglet. And this method of violently smashing their skulls into the pavement is officially approved by both Red Tractor and the RSPCA. You know, the same RSPCA which confiscated Kurt Zuma's cat because he kicked it. Those pigs killed in their infancy, though, may be the lucky ones, because those who make it to their adulthood after a lifetime of confinement are most commonly killed in this country by being forced into a cage, which is then lowered into a gas chamber, where concentrated CO2 causes them to thrash around in confused agony until this colourless, odourless gas finally snuffs them out. And globally, we kill about 1.5 billion pigs alone every single year. These animals are, then, forcibly impregnated, mutilated, caged, fattened, and forced into a gas chamber so that we can have a bacon sandwich. If we are a nation of animal lovers, then surely we should expect the same kind of public outcry and anger about this abject abuse of pigs as there has been about Kurt Zuma. Probably even more, since we're talking about billions of animals here, and yet, as we well know, we're generally met with radio silence. In fact, the same people who are spamming the dislike button of Brooke Houtz's YouTube videos because they love dogs so much are the same people who will not only fail to condemn this unthinkable treatment of pigs, but will continue to be the reason that it continues by continuing to pay for the food that it produces. Why is it, I want to ask, that those who condemn Kurt Zuma for kicking his cat are called animal lovers, but those of us who refuse to pay for pigs to be mutilated and violently killed by refusing to eat animals altogether are called weird and extreme and strange and preachy? Are vegans really any more preachy about this abuse of pigs than the rest of the public is about the abuse of dogs? Think about how these billions of pigs that we mutilate every single year, how their shrill cries of anguish will go unanswered by an apathetic public. And compare this with how one singular instance of one cat being kicked is enough to spark the ire of an entire nation. How can this be explained? Why do we treat these animals so differently? Well, Kurt Zuma kicked his cat just for fun. We eat pigs for food, which we need to eat. We need sustenance and protein and health. I'm afraid that this is an inadequate response. It would only work if the only place we could get food and sustenance and health and protein were from animals. But this is simply not true. Every nutrient required to live healthily can be found on an adequately planned vegan diet. What's the only thing that you can genuinely only get from an animal and not from a vegan alternative? It's the way they taste. That's it. All these other excuses for killing animals, food, sustenance, health, protein, all of these things can be found without killing an animal, and therefore don't function as excuses for killing an animal at all. So we don't kill these pigs because we need them for food. We don't need them for food. We kill them for pleasure, which is the same reason that Kurt Zuma kicked his cat, and I just think that we should be condemning both equally. There are, of course, people in this world who, either due to their food allergies or their location on the planet, perhaps they're struggling with an eating disorder or live with a difficult family, will not be able to entirely eliminate healthily animal products from their diet. Of course, I understand and sympathize with these people fully. My only argument is that if we can stop eating these products, then we should. If you find yourself in a situation where you genuinely need to eat an animal in order to be healthy and to survive, then of course it's permissible. But if you're given the choice to harm an animal or not harm an animal, that is, if you find yourself in a situation where it's not necessary to harm and kill an animal, then I think we should refuse to do so. And by normalizing a diet that doesn't harm animals, and by beginning to see these animals as sentient individuals who do not deserve to suffer, we can help to advance new food technologies which will help those people who can't go vegan today potentially go vegan in the future. Think about those animals that we mutilate, abuse, and torture for their flesh. Now, imagine for a moment that instead of doing this to pigs, we were doing this to 1.5 billion dogs or cats every year. Imagine if, when you asked me if I'm a dog person or a cat person, I replied that, well, it depends what kind of wine I'm having it with. Imagine, in other words, that I were paying for somebody regularly to breed, cage, and mutilate dogs, killing some puppies by caving in their skulls against the pavement and killing the rest in a gas chamber. What would you think of me if I were to admit to doing such a thing even once, let alone multiple times a day? And yet change only the species, and this is exactly what we do to animals by the billion every single year so that we can enjoy the taste of their flesh and secretions. And imagine if I were torturing dogs and eating their corpses, and you told me that you thought this was immoral, and I replied by accusing you of being preachy, and told you to stop shoving your opinions down my throat. Yeah, if you don't want to abuse dogs, that's fine. In fact, I respect that. But you've got to respect my choice to abuse dogs if I want to. This is how it feels to be a vegan. And as for the claim that eating these products is somehow natural, there is simply nothing natural about a factory farm. Artificial insemination, caging, fattening, thumping, mutilation, gas chambers, none of this, none of it, is natural. And this idea that somehow one animal being a pet and another being a farm animal makes all the difference is a sophistry. If it was wrong for Kurt Zuma to kick his cat because it was a pet, how would you feel about the same thing being done to a stray cat that he found on the street? Well, farm animals are bred for the purpose of being eaten. They wouldn't exist if we weren't eating them eventually. Well, suppose Kurt Zuma were to breed a cat into existence in order to kick it around. Would that make it any more just? I'll leave that to your consideration. It's often said that vegans are annoying because they keep trying to force their views on other people, whatever this even really means. But who's really doing the forcing here? If you have the right to force a pig into a gas chamber, then surely I have the right to force you into a conversation about your justification for doing so. And that's just pigs. We kill around 180 million chickens every day for their flesh. Around 7 billion male chicks are gassed, suffocated, or ground up alive in a macerator every single year by the egg industry. Since I started this sentence, around 150,000 wild fish have been caught from our oceans. That's about 4 seconds, by the way. In 2 minutes, that number will have risen to 3.6 million. As for milk and cheese, the dairy industry forcibly impregnates cows so that they'll start lactating, and when the calves are born, separates that mother from her calf, which causes the same kind of psychological distress as it would if you did it to a human. This immense distress is felt by both the mother and the calf, both of whom will themselves eventually be slaughtered, perhaps by forcing a bolt through their brain, or perhaps, in the case of religious slaughter, by slashing open their throats while they're still fully conscious. Now, why are we doing this? Why is it that we are forcing these innocent, abused, mutilated animals into actual gas chambers by the billion per year? This isn't for some noble purpose. This isn't to help us win a war. This isn't to buttress the economy. This isn't to help us build infrastructure. All of this unthinkable misery and abject torture is occurring so that we can eat these animals, because we like the way they taste. We are elevating one of our most trivial interests above the most basic interests of these animals, and all that we have to do to end all of this, all that we have to do to bring an end to this industrialized engine of actual animal torture is choose something else on the menu. That's it. If I walk into a coffee shop and I order a latte, I am paying for, and thus, economically speaking, demanding the continuation of the separation of calves from their mothers, their disbudding with a hot iron, their confinement, and their eventual slaughter. If I go into that same coffee shop and add a single word, I'll have an oat latte, or a soy latte, or an almond latte, or a hazelnut latte, or any one of the myriad options now available to us. None of this happens on my dime. I no longer pay for this to occur. Walking into that shop, or a restaurant, or a supermarket, we are, in the final analysis, faced with a very simple choice. We either pay for an animal to be mutilated and abused, or we do not. Focus again on Brooke Houtz's dog, or Kurt Zuma's cat. Recall the anger that you felt upon hearing about their abuse. Consider the fervency with which the public has demanded that they be prosecuted and never allowed near an animal again. And now ask yourself a question. Given the choice, who would you rather be? Kurt Zuma's cat, forced to undergo being kicked, and kicked no less by a professional footballer, or a pig, forced to spend its entire life in these ignoble, disease-ridden hellholes that we call factory farms, mutilated, caged, and killed in a gas chamber. I know which I'd rather be. It's no question. So now ask yourself why it is that most people's moral concern only tends to extend to one of these animals, and not even the animal that's undergoing the worst treatment. Why do our laws protecting animals from cruelty in this country apply differently or not at all if that cruelty results in an omelette or some ice cream? Why do we have animal cruelty laws at all if they can so arbitrarily exclude certain animals from their protection? This appears to be contradictory thinking, and contradictions cannot, by definition, be honestly maintained. Allowance of or reliance upon contradiction is the hallmark of dogma, and this particular dogma, that dogs are pets and pigs are food, and that's that, is one that we would do very well to identify, interrogate, and ultimately eliminate from our thinking. Vegans are sometimes called extreme. I may not have convinced you today to become one yourself, but at the very most, or at the very least, I should say, I hope I've convinced you that veganism is not extreme. It's a reaction against extremity. If you want extremity, look no further than what we do to animals by the billions every year in factory farms. I hope I've convinced you that it's at least a justifiable position and not one to be laughed off or ridiculed as some kind of philosophical side project. I'm often met with the dogmatic assertion that eating meat is a personal choice, whatever this really means. I wonder how the people who say this would react if I asked them to similarly respect Kurt Zuma's personal choice to kick around a cat while he's practicing for the FA Cup. Look, perhaps it is. Perhaps maybe forcing these animals to undergo the suffering that they do so that we can have some popcorn chicken is a personal choice. Fine. But if it is, I think the choice is an obvious one.